Hey restless mind, tonight we slip quietly back to a cold spring night in Trier, Germany, year 1589. You stand among a restless crowd pressed into the narrow cobbled square, the air sharp with the tang of wood smoke and the stench of unwashed wool cloaks. Lanterns sway above, their weak orange glow flickering against the half-timbered houses. The bells of St. Gangolf's church echo heavy through the damp mist, summoning villagers not to worship, but to witness. A group of shackled figures shuffle into view, most of them women, their skirts dragging through mud. You can almost taste the tension that clings to every breath, a sour mixture of fear and excitement, because everyone here knows what is about to happen, an execution for witchcraft. You probably won't survive this night if you so much as glance the wrong way. If you're fascinated by why witches were almost always women, then you're in the right place. Tonight's story unwraps the strange mix of theology, culture, and paranoia that built this cruel history. So settle in, dim the lights, and let's drift back through centuries where superstition and gender collided in brutal ways. Before we wander too far into the darkness, take a second to comment below with your local time and place. It's fun to imagine this conversation rippling across the world like an invisible bonfire of sleepy historians. Now, let's start untangling why, when the word witch was spat out in anger, suspicion almost always landed on women. Close your eyes, breathe deep, and let the story carry you. You feel the weight of history pressing in, and it all begins with the medieval church. From the earliest centuries of Christian dominance in Europe, the pulpit's teachings moulded how people imagined evil at work among them. The church framed the world as a battlefield between God and Satan, and it drilled into the faithful the idea that Satan constantly prowled, looking for human agents, and who, the clergy asked, was most vulnerable to his whispers? Women. In countless sermons, scholars and priests declared that women's bodies and minds were weaker, more unstable, and more carnal. They taught that women were easily swayed by temptation, quick to gossip, prone to jealousy, and eager for secret knowledge. This wasn't a casual insult. It was repeated in manuals, court records, and theological treatises. The entire culture absorbed the notion that the female soul was more porous to the devil's tricks. It sounds ridiculous to you now, but back then, this wasn't a fringe idea. It was official doctrine, endorsed from pulpits and university lectures alike. Walk with me down a village lane in the 13th century France. A widow tends her herbs in the back garden. She whispers to herself as she mixes chamomile and sage, her hands steady after years of practice. To you it's harmless, maybe even wholesome. But to her neighbours, already steeped in sermons about women's frailty, the scene brims with danger. A woman alone, wielding hidden knowledge, chanting in the twilight. That looks like a door the devil might stroll through. The whispers begin, and once they begin, they rarely stop. The clergy also leaned on stories that seemed to prove their point. Think of Eve, the archetype painted from Genesis. She listened to the serpent, tasted the fruit, and led Adam into ruin. For medieval preachers, this wasn't just a myth about the dawn of sin. It was an eternal warning that women were the gateway to corruption. If Eve could betray God himself in a paradise garden, what chance did your cranky neighbour, your unmarried aunt, or that argumentative midwife have of resisting the devil in a muddy medieval town? By framing women as spiritually untrustworthy, the church created a lens through which almost every misfortune could be interpreted. A bad harvest. Perhaps God was punishing the community, and maybe some woman's hidden pact with Satan triggered it. A child sickened overnight. The devil often struck through women's hands. Milk curdled in the bucket. Someone's female neighbour was probably muttering curses. It was a worldview where women were never neutral. They were either obedient daughters of the church or possible agents of hell. And here's where the nightmare spreads. The church's pronouncements weren't just abstract theology. They seeped into law codes and village customs. Inquisition courts, particularly from the 13th century onward, began collecting testimonies that routinely blamed women for everything from storms to infertility. The records are littered with phrases like, "She tempted me," "She whispered charms," "She danced with devils." And once those accusations hit parchment, they hardened into precedents, convincing future judges and inquisitors that witches existed and were, of course, female. Pause here for a cheeky observation. Imagine if every minor irritation in your life could be pinned on your next-door neighbour. Wi-Fi drops? Definitely her pact with Satan. Your sourdough collapsed? She cursed your yeast. The medieval version of scapegoating was not only cruel but also astonishingly efficient. The sheer repetitiveness of this teaching, from pulpits, in court documents, in university theology, meant that ordinary villagers didn't need to invent the idea of female witches. It was handed to them ready-made. By the 15th century, the assumption was so ingrained that if you heard sorcerer, you might imagine a scholarly man with dusty books. But if you heard witch, you instantly pictured a woman, usually poor, widowed, or outspoken. Let's not overlook the deep anxieties of the time. Medieval Europe was a world of famines, plagues, and endless wars. Life expectancy barely scratched 40. When disasters struck, communities clawed for explanations, and the official one, whispered by priests and absorbed by neighbours, was that evil women consorted with Satan. Fear was a convenient glue holding the story together. Consider a specific moment. In Basel, Switzerland, around 1470, a group of women were dragged into trial after a spate of child deaths. The court records reveal bizarre accusations. One woman supposedly smothered infants with her breath, another poisoned milk just by glancing at it. To you, these charges are absurd. But in a culture where theology taught that women were prone to the devil's whispers, they felt plausible, and once plausible, they became deadly. Notice also how male authority structured the entire process. The accusers were often men. The judges, clerics, and scribes were men. The manuals guiding trials, written in Latin, inaccessible to most villagers, were penned by male scholars. Women appeared in these texts almost exclusively as objects of suspicion. It's as if half the population had been cast in a play where their only roles were obedient wife, or possible witch. You can sense the suffocating effect this had. A woman with knowledge of herbs? Witch. A woman who survived childbirth when others didn't? Witch. A woman whose cow produced more milk? Witch. The bar for suspicion was comically low, and once whispers turned into a formal trial, the odds of survival shrank. Torture, designed to force confessions, almost always produced admissions of witchcraft. And whose names would the accused women often cry out under pain? Other women, dragging neighbours and friends into the same pit. It's worth noting here that accusations weren't random bolts from the blue. They clustered around fault lines of gender and status. Widows without male protectors were especially vulnerable. Women who spoke too freely, who rejected marriage, or who owned small bits of property outside a man's control, all became prime suspects. The theology of female weakness dovetailed perfectly with the social urge to police women who didn't fit neatly into patriarchal boxes. And behind it all, the church's voice boomed, reinforcing the idea that to doubt women's culpability was to doubt Scripture itself. Think about how trapped you'd feel in such a world. Every action could be interpreted as evidence of Satan's hand, and every defense you offered could be twisted into proof of guilt. If you said nothing, silence showed witchcraft. If you protested, the devil was speaking through you. A rigged game with stakes as high as your life. The introduction to this dark history, then, rests on one clear foundation: the early church's determination to define women as spiritually suspect. That determination created centuries of cultural suspicion, court practice, and casual paranoia. It explains why, as witch hunts spread across Europe and later the Americas, the accused were overwhelmingly women. You're beginning to see how the tragedy was built step by step, from pulpit to village lane, from scripture to scaffold. And even though centuries separate you from those cobbled squares and smoky trials, the echoes remain. Because once an institution declares half the human race as weaker, fallen, or dangerous, history tends to remember. And history, as you'll notice tonight, has a long memory. You keep walking through that medieval square, smoke still clinging to your throat, and the next thread of the story unfurls naturally: church doctrine about women. If you want to understand why women became the default targets for witchcraft accusations, you have to stand inside the intellectual architecture the medieval church built brick by brick. And those bricks were sermons, letters, theological treatises, and canon law, all stacked to convince the faithful that women were fragile, flawed, and spiritually risky. Step back into the 12th century, when universities like Paris and Bologna were flourishing. Students hunched over parchment, quills scratching furiously while masters lectured on scripture and the writings of the church fathers. Those fathers, Augustine, Tertullian, Jerome, had already left behind a paper trail of suspicion toward women. Augustine, for instance, spent pages arguing that women were necessary for reproduction, but otherwise spiritually subordinate to men. Tertullian went further, branding women the devil's gateway, and Jerome, champion of virginity, taught that even marital sex tainted women with sin. These texts weren't fringe opinions. They were baked into the curriculum, taught as authoritative truth. You can almost hear the echo in the vaulted lecture halls. Women are weaker, women are dangerous, women are always closer to temptation. Imagine sitting in the pews of a village church in England around 1250. The priest, trained on these very texts, delivers his Sunday homily. His voice booms against the cold stone walls. As Eve was deceived, so too are her daughters more liable to deception. The congregation nods. They don't question the logic because it's not just opinion, it's God's word as filtered through holy men. By the time you leave the service, you're convinced that every woman in your village is a potential liability to the spiritual health of the community. The effect was cumulative. Medieval culture absorbed these lessons like a sponge. Women's inferiority wasn't just preached, it was codified in canon law. For instance, testimony from women was often considered less credible than men's. Inheritance rights were limited. Access to education was tightly restricted. All of this reinforced the same message. Women were dependent creatures, their authority secondary, their judgment questionable, and once you start from that baseline, it's a short step to suspecting them of darker spiritual failings. Let's pause for a sarcastic aside. If you were a medieval man, this system was spectacular. Not only did you get land, education, and legal credibility, but you also got a free pass to blame almost any misfortune on the women around you. Did your crops fail because you oversalted your own fields? Nope. Clearly your neighbour's wife whispered a spell. That nagging cough you got from standing in the rain? Surely caused by the widow down the road. Very convenient, isn't it? The church also emphasised the notion of women as lustful by nature. This idea was repeated endlessly in confessional guides written for priests. Handbooks advised confessors to probe women more carefully about sins of the flesh, since women were assumed to indulge in them more. It's a curious double bind. Women were labelled as both weak and dangerously powerful. Weak in reason, strong in temptation. On one hand, too frail to resist sin, on the other, powerful enough to drag men down into it. That paradox made them irresistible scapegoats. You can see this paradox play out in the way sermons described witchcraft. A witch wasn't imagined as a mighty sorceress hurling lightning bolts. More often, she was portrayed as a frail, foolish woman who nevertheless served as Satan's entry point. That alignment of weakness with catastrophic danger made women's supposed witchcraft both believable and terrifying. One illuminating example comes from Thomas Aquinas, the heavyweight of medieval theology. In his Summa Theologica, he discussed women's nature with his usual calm precision. He concluded that women were indeed defective compared to men, a kind of failed version of the male form. For Aquinas, this wasn't just biology, it was theology. Men reflected God's rational order more fully, while women reflected it less perfectly. Translate that into everyday assumptions, and suddenly half the population becomes permanently suspect. This doctrine didn't stay locked in ivory towers. It filtered down through preaching manuals that instructed priests on how to speak about women. One widely circulated manual, the Speculum Laecorum, Mirror of Laypeople, explicitly warned that women were more easily seduced by demons. Picture the effect. Countless parish priests repeating this warning to their flocks Sunday after Sunday. Generations grew up marinated in the belief that women's souls were softer clay in the devil's hands. And let's not forget monastic culture. In monasteries and convents, celibacy reigned, but so did suspicion. Monks were urged to avoid women altogether lest they be tempted. In hagiographies, the biographies of saints, women often appeared as obstacles to holiness, distractions, or outright temptresses. Even when women were celebrated as saints, their virtue was almost always defined by virginity, silence, or extreme humility. The message was clear. The only safe woman was the one who renounced everything that made her independent or powerful. Take Hildegard of Bingen, one of the rare women theologians of the 12th century. She produced visions, writings, and music that dazzled audiences, but even she had to frame her authority carefully, always attributing her knowledge to divine inspiration rather than her own intellect. Why? Because the doctrine of female weakness meant that a woman claiming independent wisdom risked being labelled a fraud, or worse, a witch. Hildegard survived precisely because she navigated those narrow expectations so cleverly. Meanwhile, everyday women weren't so fortunate. Consider how doctrine shaped village gossip. If a cow suddenly stopped producing milk, suspicion fell easily on the older woman next door. After all, the priest had preached last week that women's tongues were sharper than men's, their envy greater, their souls weaker. In that climate, it didn't take much to see a neighbour's misfortune as evidence of a pact with the devil. Doctrine also influenced art and popular imagination. Medieval plays, church murals, and mystery pageants often portrayed women as sources of trouble. Eve appeared constantly, handing Adam the fruit. Jezebel schemed. Delilah betrayed. These images burned themselves into collective memory, reinforcing what sermons and laws had already declared. By the 14th century, when fears of witchcraft surged, the stage was perfectly set. Women were already the archetypal sinners. All you had to do was add the devil to the script, and witch hunts practically wrote themselves. Even childbirth, that most fundamental experience of women's lives, was framed through suspicion. Priests taught that labour pains were punishment for Eve's sin. Midwives, who wielded practical knowledge about herbs and birthing, often attracted suspicion precisely because their expertise wasn't filtered through male authority. A woman helping other women in a moment of life and death. According to doctrine, that smelled too much like forbidden power. And of course, this worldview served power structures brilliantly. By insisting that women were inherently flawed, the Church justified limiting their voices in politics, their education, their roles in religious life. If women were closer to the devil, then naturally men must lead them. Witch trials weren't just random outbreaks of hysteria. They were logical outcomes of centuries of indoctrination that had painted women as weaker vessels, always one whisper away from corruption. Here's another little ironic twist. Men who dabbled in alchemy or astrology often escaped the witch label, being described instead as scholars or natural philosophers. The exact same practices, when performed by women, were cast as dangerous witchcraft. That discrepancy wasn't accidental. It was the direct fruit of doctrine that positioned men as rational explorers of God's creation, and women as irrational servants of the devil. When you put it all together, the Church Fathers' writings, the legal codes, the sermons, the confession manuals, the art, you see how comprehensive the system was. Women didn't have to commit actual witchcraft to be suspected. They only had to exist in a world where doctrine had already condemned them as prone to it. As you drift further into this story, you can almost feel the inevitability pressing in. Once doctrine had painted women as spiritually suspect, every misfortune, every illness, every failed harvest had an easy explanation. Why witches were almost always women wasn't a random quirk of history. It was the deliberate outcome of centuries of teaching that made it nearly impossible to imagine otherwise. You're still walking those uneven cobblestones, but now the path bends straight toward the oldest story of all, Eve, the garden, and original sin. If you want to see why women became the archetypal witches, you need only open the first pages of Genesis, the text medieval Europe treated as the unshakable blueprint for human nature. Eve's decision to pluck fruit from the tree of knowledge, urged on by the serpent was more than a tale of curiosity. It was the foundational myth that shaped centuries of suspicion, defining women not just as weak, but as the ones who let evil into the world in the first place. Picture the medieval imagination at work. You sit in a wooden pew in a dark church around 1320, listening to your parish priest thunder about sin. His sermon is not subtle. It was not Adam but Eve who first gave ear to the serpent. The echo of those words ricochets off stone walls, lodging deep in the minds of the congregation. The villagers shuffle out into the muddy streets, and the lesson they carry is stark. Every woman is a daughter of Eve, and every woman carries her guilt. This interpretation wasn't casual. Theologians weaponized it relentlessly. Tertullian, one of the early church fathers, went straight for the jugular when he addressed women. You are the devil's gateway. He insisted that women bore responsibility not only for Adam's fall, but for Christ's death, because if sin hadn't entered through Eve, the crucifixion wouldn't have been necessary. No pressure, ladies. Talk about being saddled with cosmic blame for eternity. The narrative hardened across centuries. Preachers cast Eve as curious, greedy, and seductive. Adam, in contrast, was often painted as passive, even noble, deceived by Eve's persuasion. This lopsided framing meant that women weren't just weak. They were dangerous to men, dragging them down from righteousness. You can see why witchcraft accusations latched onto this archetype so easily. If Eve could be swayed by a serpent in paradise, surely your gossipy neighbour could be swayed by a demon in your village. Here's where the joke writes itself. Eve ate one piece of fruit, and suddenly every woman in Europe was considered a potential satanic conspirator. Imagine if one guy in history accidentally microwaved fish at the office, and for the next 1,000 years all men were banned from kitchens. That's how wildly disproportionate this myth became. But medieval thinkers weren't content with vague sermons. They dissected the Genesis story to extract detailed lessons about women. Thomas Aquinas, the intellectual heavyweight of the 13th century, argued that Eve's creation from Adam's rib symbolized her subordination. She wasn't formed from his head, because she was not to rule, nor from his feet, because she was not to be trampled, but from his side, because she was to be subject and supportive. Sounds sweet until you realize this was the theological equivalent of duct-taping women into obedience and sealing the edges with divine authority. Original sin wasn't just theology, it became daily life. The doctrine taught that all human beings were born tainted, but women were doubly tainted. They carried the guilt of Eve's act and the weakness of her nature. Childbirth itself was explained as punishment. In pain you shall bring forth children, God had told Eve. So when medieval women screamed in agony through labour, it wasn't seen as biology, it was theology. Their suffering was proof of Eve's crime echoing through time. This connection between Eve and pain tied directly into suspicion of women's healing knowledge. Midwives who used herbs and techniques to ease childbirth were often accused of interfering with God's judgment. If labour was punishment, then soothing it looked like subversion. Once again, women's skills became framed as sinister, while men's medical experiments, often far less effective, were called science. Art reinforced the same script. Medieval stained glass, tapestries, and mystery plays showed Eve handing Adam the fruit, her face sometimes sly, sometimes mournful, but always responsible. Even the serpent often took on female features in paintings, depicted with a woman's head and torso merging Eve and the devil into one image. Imagine being a woman in that world. You walk into church and stare up at a window where your ancestor, painted with your same body shape, is literally the snake who doomed mankind. Subtle. This mythology shaped not only how women were viewed, but how they viewed themselves. Confessional manuals instructed women to confess sins of curiosity, vanity and lust more thoroughly, since they were assumed to be prone to them. Spiritual guides urged women to adopt extreme humility, silence, and obedience to counteract Eve's legacy. To resist these roles was not just rebellion against men, it was rebellion against God. And rebellion against God, well, that's basically the definition of witchcraft in the medieval mind. Take the case of a 15th century trial in Arras, France. A group of women were accused of attending a witch's sabbath. Witnesses claimed they danced, feasted, and kissed the devil's backside. Ridiculous? Of course. But the trial transcripts lean heavily on Eve's archetype, framing these women as repeating her ancient mistake, listening to Satan, enjoying forbidden pleasure, and corrupting men along the way. It didn't matter whether the evidence made sense, the myth made it believable. Even more striking, women were often accused of corrupting children, echoing the idea that Eve passed sin to her descendants. Mothers who lost infants to illness sometimes found themselves suspected of witchcraft, as though their grief made them guilty. Eve's curse twisted into a cultural reflex. If children died, blame the women. Here's another modern aside. In today's world, people argue endlessly about whose fault the Wi-Fi outage is. Imagine if, instead of blaming the router, you blamed your aunt because Eve once ate fruit. That's the level of absurdity we're dealing with. The Eve narrative also provided a script for disciplining women socially. When women spoke too boldly, they were compared to Eve usurping Adam's role. When they showed curiosity in learning, they were accused of repeating her desire for forbidden knowledge. When they expressed sexual agency, they were painted as temptresses like Eve, dragging men into sin. The myth was endlessly elastic, stretching to cover any behaviour men disliked. The linkage between Eve and witchcraft hardened especially in the late Middle Ages, when fear of diabolism surged. Manuals like the Formicarius and eventually the Malleus Maleficarum, which we'll meet later, leaned heavily on the Genesis story. The serpent's whisper was interpreted as a template. Demons approached women first because women were more gullible, and once demons had them, they could lead entire communities astray. That logic justified not just suspicion, but full-blown panic. Yet even amid this suffocating theology, some women tried to flip the narrative. Medieval mystics like Marjorie Kempe claimed visions of Christ, often framing themselves as new Eves, redeemed by obedience. They tried to show that women too could channel holiness. But the fact that they had to define themselves in relation to Eve proves how deeply the myth dominated the cultural script. You weren't just a woman, you were Eve's daughter, and that identity came with a permanent asterisk. As you let this section sink in, you can see the domino effect. Once Eve was defined as the origin of sin, every woman inherited that suspicion. It made witchcraft accusations not random, but inevitable. If the first woman opened the door to the devil, then of course her daughters might do the same. By the time trials swept across Europe, no one needed to invent stereotypes about women. Genesis had already done the heavy lifting. The tragedy is clear. A single story, written millennia before, hardened into centuries of persecution. All because one woman supposedly bit into fruit, half the population was forever framed as witches in waiting. That's how mythology and doctrine fused into lived terror, and how the word witch became almost synonymous with woman. You keep drifting further into this uneasy world, where sermons echo in stone naves and suspicion seeps through timbered walls, and now the thread turns toward women's work, medicine, healing, and the peculiar figure of the midwife. If the church doctrine and the story of Eve planted seeds of mistrust, it was the daily visibility of women's knowledge in health and childbirth that watered those seeds until they grew into thick weeds of accusation. Women who touched bodies, mixed herbs, and guided new life into the world stood right at the boundary between miracle and menace. In medieval Europe that line was thin, and often it was crossed with suspicion. Start with the simplest truth. In most villages, it was women who carried practical medical knowledge. They knew which herbs soothed fevers, which roots relieved cramps, which poultices closed wounds. This wasn't book learning from a university. It was knowledge passed mouth to ear, hand to hand, across generations. Picture a woman bent over her small wooden table, crushing dried sage with a pestle, muttering quietly to remember the proportions. Her neighbours came to her when children wheezed or when childbirth stalled. In other words, she mattered. Perhaps too much. Men, meanwhile, were writing texts in Latin about the four humours and bleeding patients with leeches. University-trained physicians existed, but they were expensive, rare, and usually attached to wealthy households. For the majority of common folk, the village healer or midwife was the doctor. And here's the problem. She was also a woman. The church viewed healing knowledge with ambivalence. On one hand, caring for the sick was a Christian duty. Monasteries even maintained infirmaries. On the other, unsanctioned healing looked suspicious, especially if it worked in ways clergy couldn't explain. Herbs, charms, whispered prayers. Where was the line between medicine and magic? The church's answer was often blunt. If a woman's remedies seemed effective but weren't approved by male authority, they were probably inspired by the devil. Consider childbirth. Midwives were indispensable. They knew how to turn a breech baby, how to cut the umbilical cord, how to stop bleeding with herbs. They handled life and death moments while men stood outside helpless. Yet precisely because they operated in that intimate, bloody, miraculous space, midwives became suspect. If a baby was stillborn, whispers started. If a mother died in labour, neighbours asked whether the midwife had botched things, or worse, cursed the child. Remember, theology taught that childbirth pain was Eve's punishment. So if a midwife tried to ease it, wasn't she interfering with God's justice? You can see the twisted logic forming. If the midwife succeeded, people marvelled nervously. If she failed, they blamed her. Either way, she walked a knife's edge. The suspicion hardened in official texts. One notorious example came from the Malleus Maleficarum in 1487, which devoted whole sections to midwives. It accused them of killing infants, offering babies to demons, and causing miscarriages through spells. According to the manual, midwives were among the most dangerous witches because they had the access to new life. If Satan wanted to strike at God's creation, who better to recruit than the woman who caught babies as they entered the world? That was the logic, chilling in its simplicity. But accusations weren't limited to childbirth. Healing herbs were equally dangerous territory. Take rue, for instance, an herb used for digestive troubles and sometimes contraception. If a woman gave it to a neighbour and the neighbour miscarried, the healer could be accused of sorcery. Or think about mandrake, a root with pain-numbing properties, but a reputation steeped in myth. Its forked shape, resembling a human figure, made it seem uncanny. A woman who used it effectively might be whispered about as having powers beyond nature. The irony is almost too much. Men experimenting with minerals and alchemy were called natural philosophers. Women mixing thyme and honey were called witches. The difference wasn't in the practice, but in the gender of the practitioner. And once a practice was labelled witchcraft, it became evidence of a pact with the devil, not a demonstration of hard-earned wisdom. Let's dip into an actual case. In 1324, Alice Keitler, a wealthy woman in Kilkenny, Ireland, was accused of sorcery. Among the charges, concocting potions from herbs and animal parts, some allegedly used to harm others. The trial records reveal a swirl of suspicion around her remedies, which mixed medicine and magic in the eyes of her accusers. While Alice escaped, her servant Petronilla de Meath was burned, one of the first women executed for witchcraft in Ireland. Notice the pattern. A woman with healing or medical knowledge became an obvious target when accusations flared. Even folk practices intended as blessings could be twisted into curses. Imagine sprinkling holy water mixed with herbs at a doorway to protect against illness, a common custom. To you, it's piety. To a suspicious neighbour, it's sorcery. Medieval life blurred the lines so thoroughly that almost any woman's action could be flipped into evidence of witchcraft if circumstances demanded, and circumstances demanded it often. Consider how volatile communities were. Famine, plague, infant mortality, constant war. When life teetered on the edge, people grasped for explanations. It was easier to blame the woman mixing herbs than to accept the randomness of disease. Easier to accuse the midwife of demonic influence than to admit that childbirth was a gamble with high odds of death. Witchcraft accusations gave fear a target, and that target was usually the woman with knowledge outside male control. Of course, not all suspicion came from the church. Village rivalries played a role too. If a healer charged for her services, she could be resented. If she seemed more successful than a neighbour, jealousy flared. A failed remedy might turn a client into an enemy. And once gossip began, it merged easily with the theological script already waiting. Women are weak, women consort with demons, women pass on Eve's curse. Think about the broader symbolism. Men claimed the authority of reason, study, and divine order. Women, in contrast, were associated with the body, blood, childbirth, and nature. So when disasters struck, it felt natural, in that warped worldview, to blame the ones tied to flesh and earth. Healing, ironically, made women more vulnerable because it put them in direct contact with life's messiest edges. Here's a modern joke to keep you awake. If you go to the pharmacy today and the ibuprofen works, you don't accuse the pharmacist of demonic pacts. But in the 15th century Europe, that's exactly how logic worked, especially if the pharmacist happened to be a woman without a university diploma. Some women tried to protect themselves by cloaking their remedies in religion. They'd recite prayers, invoke saints, or frame their cures as divine gifts. It helped sometimes, but even this was risky. A prayer said too confidently might sound like an incantation. A charm written too neatly might look like a spell. Safety was elusive. The suspicion reached absurd levels in some regions. In Germany, a midwife could be interrogated not only about her practices but about whether she had ever kissed the devil or flown to Sabbaths at night. No proof was needed. Her gender, occupation, and knowledge were proof enough. Torture wrung out confessions that only reinforced the stereotype. Yes, I killed babies. Yes, I mixed potions. Yes, I flew on a broom. Once the script existed, women were forced to read their lines under duress. Step back and look at the big picture. Why were witches almost always women? Because the most visible roles women held, healing, midwifery, caregiving, were recast as dangerous. Add in theology that branded them weaker, and myths that tied them to Eve's sin, and suddenly the everyday work of sustaining life became grounds for death. It was a brutal irony. The hands that delivered babies, soothed fevers, and nursed the sick were the same hands accused of clasping the devils. This section closes with a heavy truth. Women's medical and midwifery knowledge should have been celebrated as expertise, but instead it became a liability. The very acts that kept communities alive made women vulnerable to charges of witchcraft. Once again, the pattern is clear. Being a woman in medieval Europe meant walking with suspicion as a shadow, and nowhere was that shadow darker than in the birthing chamber or the healer's hut. You move now from the healer's smoky cottage to another realm of suspicion. Not herbs, not childbirth, but bodies themselves. If Eve's myth saddled women with sin, and midwifery painted them as dangerous wielders of life, then sexuality tied the whole knot tighter. Women's sexuality, in the medieval and early modern imagination, wasn't just a private matter. It was a cosmic risk, a spiritual fault line, and it lay at the centre of why accusations of witchcraft stuck so easily to women. Picture the Church's worldview. Men and women were unequal not only in social status but in fleshly appetite. Theologians argued endlessly over who was more lustful, but the consensus leaned heavily against women. Women were said to burn hotter, crave more, and lead men astray. Their very bodies were considered unstable, moist, changeable. Words drawn from Galenic medical theory that conveniently doubled as metaphors for moral instability. A man was rational. A woman was a cauldron of unruly desire. And if she was unruly, who might be stirring that pot but the devil himself? Consider Augustine's reflections. He agonized over the pull of desire, admitting how hard it was to control. To explain his own struggles, he placed blame on women's inherent power to seduce. It wasn't that men failed, it was that women tempted. This rhetorical sleight of hand would echo for centuries, and when lust was equated with sin, and sin with Satan, then women's sexuality itself could look like witchcraft in disguise. Now imagine daily life. A widow in a small German town earns a little independence. Without a husband's authority, she manages her own home. But if she also seems flirtatious, if she looks at younger men or simply refuses to shrink into mourning, gossip starts. She's unnatural, people whisper. She tempts, she entices, and temptation is just the devil's recruitment poster. Suddenly she's not just an independent woman, she's a likely witch. The contradiction was glaring. On one hand, women were told to be chaste, modest, silent. On the other, they were constantly accused of being sexually ravenous, insatiable, and scheming. The Malleus Maleficarum pounced on this paradox, devoting long, frothing passages to women's supposed carnal weakness. It declared that women were more credulous and more carnal than men, therefore more likely to serve demons. According to its authors, demons preferred women because they could use sex to bind them. The result? Women were damned as both temptresses and victims, guilty no matter what role they played. Visual culture hammered this home. Think of frescoes where demons clutch women's breasts, woodcuts where witches kiss the devil, plays where the seductress drags the righteous man down. Even animals joined the imagery. Cats, goats, and snakes slithered into association with female sexuality. To the medieval eye, every symbol shouted the same message. Women's bodies were doors through which evil slunk into the world. One striking thread is how witch trial records obsessed over confessions of sexual encounters with demons. Women were interrogated about whether they had lain with incubi, whether the devil had visited their beds, whether their lust was so great they consented to monstrous embraces. Torture extracted the answers authorities wanted. Under unbearable pain, women admitted to lurid stories. Judges then triumphantly pointed to these confessions as proof that female sexuality was corrupt and diabolical. It was a vicious cycle. Doctrine framed women as lustful. Trials demanded proof of lust. Torture manufactured confessions, and those confessions reinforced doctrine. Let's slip into a concrete case. In 1612, during the infamous Pendle witch trials in England, women like Alice Nutter and Anne Whittle were accused of attending Sabbaths where they supposedly copulated with spirits and devils. Did their accusers have any evidence? Number. But the broader culture had already trained people to see women's sexuality as suspect. The women's poverty, independence, and occasional sharp tongues were enough to trigger charges that spiraled into death sentences. The fixation on sexuality also policed women's behaviour in subtle ways. A woman who laughed too loudly, who dressed too brightly, or who resisted marriage could be marked as lascivious. Villagers noticed, gossiped, and stored away suspicions for the next calamity. When the cow died, or the storm hit, That colourful neighbour suddenly looked like a devil's mistress. Sexuality, even hinted, became a time bomb waiting to explode into accusation. And the double standard was relentless. Men's sexual sins were framed as weakness, forgivable lapses, or the fault of women who tempted them. Women's sexual sins, real or imagined, were framed as proof of a deeper allegiance to evil. A monk caught with a mistress might be scolded. A woman rumoured to enjoy sex might be burned. It wasn't logic. It was power disguised as morality. Now here's a cheeky modern comparison. Imagine your dating app messages being subpoenaed by a medieval court. You sent 3 heart emojis, proof of lust. Lust equals sin. Sin equals witchcraft. Straight to the stake. That's essentially how loose the chain of reasoning was. The fear of women's sexuality also intersected with anxieties about fertility. Barrenness was often blamed on witches, supposedly cursing wombs. Conversely, women with many children could be envied and accused of using charms to enhance their fertility. Either way, sexuality linked to reproduction became dangerous territory. A barren wife risked suspicion. A fertile one did too. The only safe position was invisibility. Layer in another fear: nocturnal activity. Nighttime, already feared as a space of demons, was tied closely to women's supposed secret trysts. A woman wandering after dusk, perhaps fetching water, perhaps helping with childbirth, could be accused of midnight liaisons with spirits. Night plus femininity equaled danger in the medieval imagination. The witch flying through the dark sky, astride a broom or animal, became a vivid symbol of uncontrolled female sexuality, roaming free when men were asleep and authority was weakest. We also need to touch on celibacy and virginity. The Church elevated virgins as near saintly, yet even they weren't immune. A woman who resisted marriage and lived alone could be praised for chastity or condemned as unnatural. Spinsterhood blurred into witchcraft because independence itself was threatening. Virginity was safe only when cloistered in a convent, under male clerical supervision. Outside of that, it became suspicious. The obsession with sexuality in witch trials reveals something deeper: control. Accusations weren't only about theology, they were about policing women's choices, who they loved, whether they bore children, how they dressed, even how they walked. All could be monitored, judged, and punished. Sexuality was the lever, and witchcraft was the hammer that came down when women leaned too far outside the script. Let's circle back to doctrine. Writers like Jean Bodin, a French jurist, insisted in the late 16th century that witches were overwhelmingly female because of their lust. He claimed women's carnal nature made them easy prey for demons, and once seduced they eagerly spread evil. His work wasn't just scholarly, it was used in courts. Jurors and judges flipping through his pages found neat justification for what they already believed. And the obsession with female sexuality lingered beyond Europe. In New England, Puritan ministers preached endlessly about women's temptations. During the Salem witch trials of 1692, accusations against women like Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne included insinuations of lasciviousness and unnatural behaviour. Even across the Atlantic, the same old story replayed. Women's sexuality was suspicious, and suspicion was deadly. Pause for a sigh. When you pull back, you realise the cruelty wasn't only in the executions, but in the everyday pressure. Women lived under a constant gaze, their bodies policed, their desires mistranslated as pacts with the devil. To be female was to be suspect, to be sexual was to be doomed. And yet, amid the ashes, you glimpse resistance. Folk songs, secret diaries, whispered tales. These suggest that women still carved out spaces for joy, desire and love despite the surveillance. They lived, they loved, they laughed, even while knowing that one rumour could erase them. That resilience deserves its own kind of remembrance. So, why were witches almost always women? Because sexuality, natural, human, necessary, was turned into evidence of corruption. The same body that bore children, that offered comfort, that sustained households, was rebranded as a danger zone, a devil's playground. Once that idea hardened, almost any woman could be cast as a witch simply by being visible, desirable, or independent. That's the bitter legacy. Centuries of suspicion wrapped around the simplest fact of being female. And though we've moved far beyond stakes and Sabbaths, Echoes of those old fears still linger in how societies police women's bodies today. History whispers louder than we think. You've already seen how Eve's myth, church doctrine, and suspicion of women's bodies set the stage. But now the story sharpens into something far more lethal, a book that turned paranoia into a weapon. Published in 1487, the Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, was not just a dusty manual, it was a bestseller, a courtroom guide, and a cultural bombshell. And its message could not have been clearer. Witches were real, they were everywhere, and they were almost always women. Let's step back to meet its authors. Heinrich Kramer, a German inquisitor, had already built a reputation for zeal. He wanted to stamp out witchcraft and, perhaps more importantly, to prove his own authority. Alongside him, Jacob Sprenger, another Dominican, lent his name. Though some scholars suspect Sprenger's role was minimal, his reputation helped sell the book. Together, their text became the most infamous witch-hunting manual in Europe. Imagine opening its pages. You'd find not just theological arguments but courtroom instructions, lurid anecdotes, and practical tips for sniffing out witches. It combined sermon, handbook, and propaganda all in one, and it hammered home, again and again, that women were the chief culprits. The logic was circular but persuasive in its time. According to Kramer, women were weaker in faith, more carnal and prone to gossip. Therefore they were easy prey for the devil. Once seduced, they spread evil, harming crops, children, and men. The book even argued that women's sexuality made them especially dangerous, because demons could use it as a pathway into the world. It quoted scripture, twisted theology, and piled anecdote upon anecdote until doubt seemed almost impossible. To modern ears, it reads like a grotesque parody. One section boldly declares, "All witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which in women is insatiable." There you have it. Centuries of suspicion distilled into a single sentence, handed to judges as divine wisdom. The Malleus painted women as both pathetic and powerful, too weak to resist temptation, yet strong enough to ruin entire communities. A paradox, but a deadly one. The manual didn't stop at theory. It provided instructions for interrogations and trials. It encouraged the use of torture, insisting that witches would never confess otherwise. It justified stripping women naked to search for witches' marks. It suggested leading questions to trap them, and it urged judges to ignore recantations. Essentially, it codified suspicion into procedure. With the Malleus in hand, courts could move from rumour to execution with terrifying efficiency. Picture the effect on a small town. A child dies suddenly. A storm ruins crops. Neighbours whisper about the widow down the lane. Before, maybe suspicion would have fizzled. But now a local judge, armed with the Malleus, has a ready-made script. He knows exactly how to frame the charges, how to interrogate, how to justify the verdict. The book gave witch hunts a structure, and that structure tilted overwhelmingly toward condemning women. It wasn't just legal, it was cultural. The Malleus spread quickly thanks to the printing press, which had only recently transformed Europe. Within decades, copies circulated widely, influencing courts from Germany to France to Italy. It wasn't the only manual, but it was the loudest, dripping with obsessive detail about women's supposed wickedness. For literate elites, it became a reference. For the illiterate majority, its arguments filtered down through sermons and gossip. The result? A continent primed to see witches in women's faces. Let's look at a chilling example. In Innsbruck, Kramer himself attempted to prosecute women for witchcraft in the 1480s. His zeal was so extreme that even church authorities rebuked him. Yet instead of stepping back, he doubled down, writing the Malleus to defend his methods. In other words, the book wasn't born from consensus. It was born from obsession. But once published, that obsession infected entire legal systems. The manual even addressed the question of why men weren't accused as often. Its answer: men were stronger, more rational, and therefore less vulnerable to the devil. Of course, men could be witches too, but the text insisted they were the minority. Women, by nature, were the majority. This claim didn't just reflect culture, it actively shaped statistics. Judges, influenced by the Malleus, were more likely to see female suspects as credible witches, reinforcing the numbers the book had predicted. Here's a modern comparison. Imagine a crime manual today that declared all hackers are left-handed teenagers. Police reading it would start suspecting left-handed teens disproportionately. Arrest records would then confirm the manual's claim, creating a loop of proof. That's what the Malleus achieved, except the stakes were torture and burning. The text also dwelled obsessively on female sexuality. It claimed that women used witchcraft to cause impotence in men, to inflame lust, or to steal male reproductive power. The authors even spun tales of witches collecting men's genitals, storing them in nests like birds. Absurd, yes. But these lurid images fed fears that women's power was not only spiritual but bodily, and that men's very masculinity was under threat. For male judges, priests and husbands, this was nightmare fuel dressed as scholarship. And it wasn't only fear, it was also control. The Malleus reinforced patriarchal authority by insisting that women must remain subordinate to men or risk falling into witchcraft. It wasn't enough to condemn witches, it demanded obedience from all women. Submissive wives and silent daughters were safe. Independent women were dangerous. In this way, the book policed gender as much as it prosecuted crime. The scale of its influence is staggering. Historians estimate that between 1450 and 1750, roughly 40,000 to 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft in Europe, and about 75 to 80% of them were women. The Malleus wasn't responsible for every case, but it provided intellectual fuel for countless trials. Wherever its logic spread, women bore the brunt. Think of the ripple effect. A priest in a small village, inspired by a passage, preaches about women's weakness. A magistrate flipping through its pages justifies using torture on an accused midwife. A neighbour, hearing stories of witches stealing crops, repeats them with more conviction because the learned men have confirmed it. The book became a chain reaction, linking theology, law, and rumour into one deadly system, and yet not everyone accepted it. Some scholars pushed back, pointing out contradictions. Even the church hierarchy occasionally distanced itself, embarrassed by Kramer's excesses. But the damage was done. Once printed and spread, the book lived its own life, independent of official approval. Fear doesn't wait for consensus. Here's the grim comedy. The Malleus claimed women were gullible, yet it was the judges and priests, men, who believed every absurd tale the book spun. Who was more credulous, really? The irony stings across centuries. By the late 16th century, other manuals emerged, but the Malleus remained a cornerstone. Its influence waned only as legal systems modernized and skepticism grew. But by then, thousands of women had been accused, tortured, and executed, their names lost beneath the weight of pages inked by Kramer's paranoia. So why were witches almost always women? Because manuals like the Malleus didn't just reflect cultural bias. They magnified it, codified it, and spread it. They gave men in power a handbook for fear, dressed up in the language of law and theology. And once fear had a manual, it no longer needed evidence. It only needed victims. You've seen doctrine, Eve, sexuality, and the Malleus Maleficarum twist suspicion into law. But now the story shifts to something even more personal. The social roles women were forced into, and what happened when they didn't fit. Witchcraft accusations weren't hurled at random. They clustered around women who stood outside expectations. Widows, spinsters, outspoken wives, the poor, the old. These women became easy prey in a world that demanded female submission and punished deviation. Start with widows. In most villages, a widow without sons or brothers to defend her sat on the social margins. Her husband's death left her land vulnerable, her livelihood shaky, her protection thin. In patriarchal society, male guardianship was not just practical but symbolic. A woman without it seemed exposed, unnatural, and suspicious. If crops failed or livestock died, the widow's independence became an explanation. She's alone because God has cursed her, and maybe she cursed us too. Widows often relied on small trades, brewing ale, selling herbs, spinning wool. Each of these occupations could spark envy. Combine envy with vulnerability, and the result was deadly. Next come spinsters, unmarried women who refused or failed to marry. Their very existence challenged the script. Marriage and motherhood defined female virtue, so a woman outside that pattern seemed threatening. Villagers asked, why won't she marry? Is she barren? Is she too proud? Or, and here suspicion sharpened, Does she consort with darker powers instead? The unmarried woman's independence became a blank canvas onto which fears could be painted. And then there were outspoken women. Imagine a wife in a small town who scolds her neighbour loudly in the market or mocks a local official. In a world where women were told to be silent and obedient, her words carried double weight. Quarrelsome women often show up in witch trial records. Their sharp tongues, once combined with misfortune, became evidence of malice. If she cursed someone in anger, and later their cow died, the connection seemed obvious. It didn't matter that livestock deaths were common. The memory of her words became a smoking gun. Old age added another layer. Elderly women, wrinkled and toothless, embodied decline in a society terrified of death. They often lived alone, dependent on charity. Their frailty made them vulnerable to accusations, especially if they begged for food. Picture an old woman asking her neighbour for bread. If the neighbour refused and then later fell ill, the refusal became guilt. She cursed me when I turned her away. The stereotype of the hag, the crone, grew from these patterns. In folklore, the old woman muttering at the hearth was an easy stand-in for a witch. There's another detail: property. Women who inherited land or money could stir resentment. If a widow controlled property, relatives might covet it. Witchcraft accusations sometimes followed inheritance disputes, functioning as weapons in social battles. The charge wasn't just spiritual, it was practical. Convict the woman, and her property reverted to others. Convenient, isn't it? Witch hunts were often less about demons than about who got the cow, the field, or the cottage. Social roles also shaped the kinds of accusations women faced. Midwives were accused of killing infants. Alewives were accused of poisoning drinks. Spinners were accused of knot magic, tangling threads to curse men. The daily tasks women performed became transformed into evidence of supernatural malice. Ordinary labour, brewing, weaving, cooking, was recast as sorcery when fear demanded it. Take the example of Germany in the late 16th century. Records show widows and spinsters forming the majority of accused witches. Men appear too, but far fewer. And when men were accused, they often had connections to women already on trial, husbands, sons, or associates. Women bore the brunt, especially those whose lives didn't align neatly with expectations. Let's slip into a specific case. The Würzburg trials of the 1620s, among the most brutal in Europe. Hundreds were executed, many of them women. The accused included widows, young girls, even children. Testimonies reveal how social nonconformity invited suspicion. A woman who argued, who lived alone, who owned property, all these made her vulnerable. Judges, influenced by manuals like the Malleus, saw these roles not as ordinary but as signs of corruption. And gossip played its part. Villages were tight-knit. Everyone's life was on display. A quarrel at the market, a muttered complaint, an unlucky coincidence. These became ammunition. Socially isolated women lacked allies. Without husbands, brothers, or sons to defend them, they were exposed. Courts often asked, who will testify to her good character? For widows and spinsters, the answer was often no one. Silence in such cases was damning. Pause for a cheeky aside. Imagine your social media presence being judged by medieval standards. Didn't post enough couple photos? Suspiciously single? Complained too loudly about your neighbour's music? Malicious curses? Bought property on your own? Clearly you sold your soul for real estate. The absurdity is obvious now, but back then it was deadly. The policing of social roles reveals the deeper purpose of witch trials. They weren't random explosions of hysteria. They were tools of conformity. By targeting women who stepped outside prescribed roles, communities reinforced the boundaries of gender. The message was clear: marry, submit, obey, or risk the stake. It's worth noticing how accusations reflected patriarchal anxieties. Widows reminded men that women could survive without them. Spinsters reminded them that not all women desired marriage. Outspoken wives reminded them that obedience wasn't guaranteed. Elderly women reminded them of mortality. In short, these women unsettled male authority, and witchcraft accusations worked as a way to suppress that discomfort. The tragedy is that many accused women had little power to resist. Torture extracted confessions. Trials excluded defense. Once suspicion stuck, escape was rare. And so, countless women were executed not for crimes, but for existing outside narrow boxes. Let's revisit the role of quarrels. Trial records show countless cases where a curse was proven by misfortune following an argument. If a woman shouted, "You'll regret this," and later illness struck, the curse was confirmed. Words themselves, especially women's words, carried dangerous weight. Men's anger could be dismissed as temper. Women's anger was recast as sorcery. The gender bias was so baked in that a woman's sharp tongue could become evidence of a pact with Satan. There's also the matter of reproduction. A married woman without children was suspect. Infertility was often blamed on witchcraft. But a woman with many children could be suspect too, envied and accused of magical aid. The contradiction reveals the impossible bind. Women were judged no matter what. Too fertile or not fertile enough, too loud or too quiet, too independent or too dependent, all paths could lead to accusation. The image of the witch, then, was built from social anxieties. The widow, the spinster, the old crone, the quarrelsome wife, all became archetypes. Folklore cemented them, trial records repeated them, and soon the stereotype became reality. When villagers imagined a witch, they didn't picture a random man. They pictured the woman down the road who didn't fit. So, why were witches almost always women? Because social roles created traps. Step outside the narrow lane of obedient wife and mother, and suspicion waited. Be too independent, too loud, too visible, and you risked becoming the scapegoat. Witchcraft wasn't just about theology. It was about policing behaviour, forcing conformity, and punishing those who dared to live differently. And as you drift into the next section of this long night, keep the image in mind. A crooked old woman knocking at her neighbour's door, begging for bread. The door slams shut. Hours later, the neighbour's child falls sick. By morning, gossip has named her a witch. She was guilty not because of spells, but because of who she was. A woman alone, outside the script, too easy to blame. You've seen how social roles made certain women easy targets, but those roles didn't operate in isolation. They collided constantly with something sharper and more immediate: economic rivalries and village jealousy. Witchcraft accusations were rarely just about theology or doctrine. They were often the smoke rising from simmering disputes over resources, property, and survival. And because women's lives in early modern Europe were entangled with food, livestock, and neighbourhood obligations, they were the ones most often caught in the fire. Imagine life in a small 16th century German village. The houses crowd together, animals wander muddy lanes, and survival depends on harvests that never quite seem secure. Grain shortages are common, storms destroy fields, and disease stalks livestock. In this tightrope existence, envy runs deep. If one family's cow gives more milk, if one household's garden thrives while another's withers, suspicion stirs. And when suspicion looks for a human culprit, the obvious target is not the wealthy landholder or the priest, but the poor woman at the margins. Consider the role of charity. Poor women, especially widows, often begged or relied on neighbours for food. Denying them could be dangerous, not because of any real curse, but because villagers feared retaliation. If you refused bread to the widow and your child later fell ill, you might interpret it as her revenge. This pattern appears over and over in trial records. An old woman asks for help, is refused, mutters angrily, and soon after misfortune strikes. Gossip transforms the coincidence into cause. Economic inequality and fear of envy created fertile ground for witchcraft accusations. Take England in the 16th and 17th centuries. Historians have traced countless accusations to quarrels over butter, milk, or ale. These weren't trivial matters. They were essential foods, signs of household prosperity. When dairy spoiled, villagers blamed witches, often women who had asked for milk or cheese and been denied. The so-called cunning women, who sometimes practiced healing, could also be accused if their remedies failed. In each case, the underlying issue wasn't sorcery but economic stress. Scarce resources, fragile survival, and envy bubbling just beneath the surface. The concept of the limited good dominated peasant mentality. People believed prosperity was finite. If your neighbour's crops flourished, it might mean yours would fail. If her cow thrived, yours might weaken. This zero-sum worldview made envy not just a sin, but a danger. And since women were associated with household production, dairying, brewing, gardening, they became lightning rods for suspicion. Let's look at a vivid case. In 1566, in Chelmsford, England, Elizabeth Francis was accused of witchcraft. Among the charges, she bewitched livestock and neighbours who had wronged her. The trial records reveal that many accusations grew out of disputes over money and goods. Elizabeth had asked for butter, for grain, for help, and when denied, she was blamed for ensuing misfortunes. Her cat, allegedly a demonic familiar named Sathan, became the symbol of these grudges. The trial wasn't about cosmic evil. It was about neighbourly resentment in a world of scarce resources. Germany, too, saw this pattern. In villages along the Rhine, accusations often followed crop failures. If one household's field survived a frost better than another's, suspicion fell on the poorer, older woman who had quarrelled with neighbours. Rumours accused her of stealing fertility from fields, drawing milk from cows, or hoarding prosperity through magic. Again, the issue wasn't theology but economics, and women paid the price. Even in prosperous towns, competition sparked accusations. In Basel, records show disputes between women brewers, with less successful ones accusing rivals of sorcery to explain lost customers. In market economies, failure stung. Instead of blaming pricing, quality, or sheer chance, people turned to witchcraft as the explanation. The victim was almost always female because brewing, baking, and petty trade were female domains. Here's a cheeky aside. Imagine blaming your competitor's TikTok success on them hexing your Wi-Fi. That's essentially what medieval villagers did, except instead of losing followers, you risked losing livestock, food, or children. And instead of rolling your eyes, you could drag your rival into court. Accusations also intersected with inheritance disputes. A widow who controlled property might face hostility from relatives who wanted it. By accusing her of witchcraft, they could eliminate her and gain the land. Legal records across Europe reveal cases where wealthy widows, not just poor beggars, were accused. Economics, once again, sat at the root. The Salem witch trials of 1692 provide another example, though across the ocean they followed similar patterns. Scholars have noted that many of the accusers came from families on one side of Salem village's economic divide, while many accused women belonged to families on the other. Old rivalries over land, church seating, and inheritance shaped the accusations. Though Puritans framed it in spiritual terms, the underlying conflicts were worldly. Property lines and economic envy. The everyday nature of these disputes made accusations feel believable. People didn't accuse strangers from faraway towns. They accused neighbours, people they envied, people with whom they had quarrelled over bread, butter, or land. Witchcraft wasn't abstract. It was a way of making sense of everyday conflict. And because women stood at the centre of household economies, they were easiest to blame. Trial transcripts echo with this logic. In Germany, a farmer testified that after refusing milk to an old woman, his cows sickened. In Essex, a man claimed his wife fell ill after denying charity to a beggar. In France, villagers insisted that a woman who quarrelled with them caused storms. Each story followed the same script: economic exchange, denial or envy, misfortune, accusation. And in each case the accused was female. Let's pause to notice how this dovetailed with doctrine. Theology said women were weak and carnal. Social norms said widows and spinsters were suspicious. Economic rivalries gave specific incidents to latch onto. Combine all three, and you have the recipe for witch hunts. Abstract bias plus concrete quarrels equals deadly accusations. The stereotype of the witch sucking milk from cows or spoiling butter didn't come from nowhere. It came from the daily rhythms of economic life. Dairy was women's work. Brewing was women's work. Midwifery was women's work. When these spheres faltered, women bore the blame. The image of the hag muttering by the churn, souring milk with a curse, grew straight from these realities. And envy was powerful. Villagers feared it like poison. To be envied was dangerous. To envy was sinful. And women, especially poor ones, were imagined as especially envious. Manuals like the Malleus described women as driven by envy, prone to resent others' prosperity. So when disasters struck, it felt natural to imagine women channeling envy into sorcery. Here's another modern quip. Envy today might mean subtweeting someone who bought a new car. In 1600, it meant accusing your neighbour of witchcraft and watching her dragged to trial. Same emotion, radically different outcomes. As you drift deeper into this story, you see the pattern. Theology built suspicion, social roles shaped vulnerability, and economic envy lit the match. Women's lives, tied to survival tasks, made them the constant scapegoats in a fragile world. Witchcraft wasn't about flying broomsticks. It was about butter gone bad, cows gone dry, and neighbours who didn't share. and in that economy of fear, women almost always paid the price. You've seen how envy, jealousy, and daily quarrels sharpen suspicion, but now step back and watch the wider net being cast. The deliberate use of witchcraft accusations as tools of political power and control. Witch hunts weren't only local squabbles that spiraled out of hand, they were also instruments wielded by authorities to reinforce order, intimidate dissent, and remind communities who held the reins. And predictably, women were the most convenient sacrifices in this display of authority. Imagine a town council in the 16th century Germany. The mayor, the judges, the priest, all male, all anxious about maintaining obedience in a restless population. A bad harvest stirs murmurs against taxes. A new law provokes grumbling, and rumours spread of dissent. What better way to redirect anger than by finding witches among the poor and vulnerable? Trials put fear back into the people, shifted blame away from leaders, and reasserted control. The very structure of witch hunts reveals this. Public executions weren't done in secret. They were spectacles, staged in market squares. Everyone was summoned, bells rang, and sermons framed the event as a triumph of justice over evil. When a woman was burned, it wasn't just about her, it was about reminding every other villager of the power of the church, the court, and the state. The execution was a performance, one woman's body consumed to prove that authority still ruled. In places where religious conflict simmered, witch hunts became weapons. After the Protestant Reformation split Europe, Catholic and Protestant rulers both leaned on witch trials to show their godliness and legitimacy. If you were a Protestant prince trying to prove your zeal, rooting out witches became proof of faith. If you were a Catholic bishop fighting heresy, burning witches became evidence of loyalty to Rome. Women accused of witchcraft weren't simply victims of neighbours' envy. They became pawns in the chessboard of religious competition. Take the Prince-Bishopric of Würzburg in the 1620s. Hundreds were executed in one of the worst panics of the age. The trials happened during the 30 Years' War, a conflict tearing Europe apart. The bishop needed to demonstrate authority and piety, so he unleashed a ferocious campaign against witches. Entire families were accused, but women made up the majority. The executions not only rid the bishopric of supposed evil, they silenced dissenters and reinforced his control over a frightened populace. Power also shaped who was accused. Poor women, as always, filled the ranks, but wealthier or outspoken women could be targeted too if they threatened male dominance. In Bamberg, Germany, Katharina Merklerin, the wife of a councilman, was accused and executed. Her case shows that even relatively privileged women weren't safe if their position made them politically inconvenient. Eliminating them through witchcraft charges sent a clear message: no woman, however respected, could step outside the lines drawn by male authority. The Malleus Maleficarum had already framed women as natural witches, and authorities used that script to their advantage. If women were inherently weak, then purging them looked righteous rather than oppressive. In this way, misogyny became a political resource. Leaders could crush opposition while claiming to defend faith and morality. The more women burned, the stronger the message that obedience to authority was non-negotiable. Think also of how witchcraft accusations silenced women's voices. Women who criticised taxation, church corruption, or injustice risked being labelled witches. Once accused, their words lost credibility. They became rantings of a devil's servant. Witch trials worked like a gag, choking female dissent before it could spread. And the beauty of it, for rulers at least, was that it looked like divine justice, not political repression. Another example comes from Scotland in the late 16th century. King James VI, later James I of England, took personal interest in witch trials. Obsessed with the idea that witches had tried to kill him with storms, he wrote a treatise, Demonology, justifying persecution. For James, witch hunts bolstered royal authority. By portraying himself as a target of witches, he framed his survival as divine favour, strengthening his claim to rule. Once again, women's bodies became stage props in a performance of power. Here's a cheeky modern aside. Imagine a politician today blaming hackers for every policy failure, then parading captured hackers on TV to prove his strength. That's essentially what rulers did with witches, except the hackers were ordinary women, and the parades ended in fire. The political use of witch hunts also appeared in local feuds. Town councils could deploy accusations to settle disputes, eliminate rivals, or redistribute property. Because conviction often meant confiscation, authorities profited materially from executions. A condemned woman's land or goods could be seized, feeding the coffers of city treasuries. Fear wasn't just spiritual, it was profitable, and gender was central. Men accused of witchcraft did exist, but their cases often involved broader charges: heresy, sorcery, political rebellion. Women, however, were accused simply for existing at the intersection of vulnerability and suspicion. Their gender made them ideal targets, less likely to resist legally, more easily painted as weak, and symbolically linked to Eve and lust. Executing them caused less disruption than executing powerful men, yet it still satisfied the demand for justice. The trials also reinforced household hierarchy. By accusing women, authorities reminded wives, daughters, and mothers of their place. A submissive woman was safe, an independent one was dangerous. This reinforced patriarchy not just in courts but in kitchens, bedrooms, and fields. Every time a woman was condemned, it was a warning to every other woman to stay silent, obedient, and invisible. Consider the Salem witch trials in 1692. Though shaped by Puritan anxieties, they also reflected political tension in colonial Massachusetts. Factional disputes between families, fears of Native American attacks, and frustrations with distant royal authority all contributed. Women became scapegoats for conflicts far larger than themselves. When Sarah Good or Rebecca Nurse stood in court, they weren't just accused of harming neighbours, they were serving as vessels for the colony's political paranoia. And it worked. Executions provided catharsis, a sense of action, a visible display that leaders were fighting evil. Communities fractured by war, famine, or politics found unity in condemning a witch. Women's deaths became glue holding male power structures together. Pause here for another wry observation. Imagine solving every civic crisis by blaming the local baker. Road collapse, baker's fault, tax shortfall, baker's curse. That's essentially what witch hunts allowed rulers to do: redirect frustration toward women who couldn't fight back. The political use of witchcraft accusations also fed propaganda. Pamphlets and broadsheets circulated tales of women flying to Sabbaths, copulating with demons, and plotting against kings. These lurid stories thrilled readers while justifying executions. They painted rulers as guardians against chaos and witches as threats to society. Women's bodies were turned into cautionary tales, inked across pages to terrify and entertain. Step back, and the pattern is stark. Witch hunts weren't random bursts of superstition. They were orchestrated performances of control. By targeting women, already framed as weak, lustful, and suspicious, authorities reinforced their power at every level: local, national, and religious. Executions silenced dissent, redirected anger, filled treasuries, and displayed authority, and the victims, overwhelmingly women, were sacrificed to maintain the illusion of order. So, why were witches almost always women? Because women were the easiest bodies to use as political stage props. Their persecution reassured frightened villagers, legitimized rulers, and warned all others to obey. Witchcraft became less about demons and more about discipline. Discipline enforced on women to keep patriarchal and political systems intact. As you leave this section, you can almost hear the crackle of fire in the town square, the sermon booming about obedience and the hush of the crowd. One woman's death reaffirms the order of the world, not because she was a witch, but because power needed her to be. You've walked through theology, Eve, sexuality, manuals, roles, envy, and power. Now it's time to step into the trial rooms themselves and look at what actually happened to women once suspicion hardened into prosecution. Case studies make the abstract real. Faces, names, testimonies, and verdicts drawn from the ash-stained archives of Europe and beyond. And if you look closely, you see the same themes repeating: poverty, jealousy, vulnerability, gendered suspicion. These cases remind you that behind every statistic was a woman dragged from her home, questioned under duress, and judged for the crime of being herself. Let's begin in Germany, the epicenter of some of the most notorious witch trials. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, thousands were executed there. In Würzburg in the 1620s, panic swept through the region. Court records describe more than 150 executions in just a few years, many of them women. Entire families were destroyed. Among the victims were not only poor widows but also children and young girls, accused of attending Sabbaths or casting curses. One chilling entry describes a girl of only 9 years old being condemned, but the overwhelming majority were adult women, often accused after quarrels with neighbours or following sudden deaths in livestock. These women weren't caught with spell books. They were caught with reputations shaped by centuries of misogyny. Cross over to England. The Pendle witch trials of 1612 are among the most famous. 12 people were accused, most of them women. The accusations came after a travelling peddler fell ill, supposedly cursed by a young woman named Alison Device. Under questioning, Alison confessed. Whether from guilt, fear, or pressure, we cannot know. That confession spiralled into accusations against others, including her mother, grandmother, and neighbours. The resulting trial condemned 10 to death. The women of Pendle were poor, marginal, and already whispered about. Once suspicion started, the machinery of the court, primed by manuals and theology, carried them swiftly to the gallows. France saw its own horrors. In 1619, Suzanne Gaudry, a young woman from Normandy, was tried for witchcraft. She confessed under torture to attending Sabbaths, consorting with demons, and even flying. Afterward, she recanted, declaring she'd confessed only because of pain. The judges ignored her retraction. She was executed anyway. Her case shows the trap women faced. Deny, and you looked stubborn. Confess, and you sealed your fate. Recant, and no one believed you. Scotland too was gripped by ferocity. The North Berwick witch trials of 1590 became famous partly because King James VI himself took an interest. Dozens of people were accused of raising storms to sink his ship. Agnes Sampson, a respected midwife, was among them. Tortured with a device called the witch's bridle, which forced prongs into her mouth and cheeks, she eventually confessed to impossible acts. Her testimony, wrung from agony, was paraded as proof. She was strangled and burned. A healer turned scapegoat, Agnes's death encapsulates the cruelty of the system. And then there is Salem, Massachusetts, 1692. Though on another continent the patterns echo Europe. Over 200 people were accused, 20 executed, most of them women. Sarah Good, poor and quarrelsome, was an easy target. Rebecca Nurse, elderly and pious, was accused because she had property and influence. Tituba, an enslaved woman, was forced into confession, her story twisted to confirm fears of devil worship. Salem shows how deeply the European script had been transplanted. Women, especially those on the margins or those who spoke too boldly, became witches in the eyes of their neighbours. Trial records reveal the obsession with gendered details. Women were accused of spoiling butter, souring milk, or harming infants, all tied to female roles. Men accused of witchcraft were more often linked to heresy or political rebellion. The charges themselves reinforced gender lines. Women were punished for domestic failures, men for public ones. One striking case comes from Trier, Germany, where trials in the late 16th century executed hundreds. Among the condemned was a woman accused because her neighbours claimed she muttered when turned away from charity. Soon after, a storm ruined crops. That coincidence became evidence. Evidence became trial, and trial became execution. She was guilty not of sorcery, but of being poor, needy, and female in a society that feared all three. The language of trials reveals another layer. Women were often described as shrill, nagging, or disobedient. Their supposed personality flaws became legal evidence. Imagine being judged not for actions, but for temperament. A quarrelsome man was just hot-headed. A quarrelsome woman was a witch. The double standard was baked into the transcripts, word by word. Torture, too, was deeply gendered. Women's bodies were stripped, searched, and prodded for witches' marks, supposed blemishes where demons had touched them. Midwives were forced to examine one another, turning women against women. Interrogators asked explicit, humiliating questions about sexuality, reinforcing the link between female bodies and suspicion. The process wasn't just about extracting confessions, it was about degrading women until they fit the role written for them. And once accusations began, they spread like wildfire. Trials created networks of guilt. Under torture, women were forced to name others, usually neighbours. One woman's confession became 10 more accusations. Communities cannibalized themselves, especially targeting the vulnerable. Women dragged other women down with them, not from malice but from unbearable pain. The fear reached absurd proportions. In Bamberg, Germany, a man's letter from prison described how every accused person named others under torture. "There are so many that no one will be spared," he wrote. In that frenzy, women bore the brunt. They were already expected to be witches, so naming them seemed natural. The more names spilled out, the more women were destroyed. Even children were not safe. In Würzburg, girls as young as 9 were executed. In Salem, the first accusers were young girls whose fits and visions pointed fingers at adult women. Ironically, children's testimonies, often shaped by imagination or manipulation, carried deadly weight when directed against women. It was as if society trusted girls only when they accused women of evil. Step back and you see the pattern. Case after case, across centuries and countries, the majority of victims were women. Sometimes poor, sometimes wealthy, sometimes old, sometimes young, but always women marked by vulnerability, difference, or defiance. Their deaths were not accidents of hysteria, but the predictable outcome of a system that had already written them into the role of the witch. Here's a modern aside. Imagine if losing a tennis match today allowed your opponent to accuse you of hacking gravity. Courts convene, neighbours testify, and suddenly your life is on the line. That's how flimsy the evidence was, and how rigid the stereotypes were. What these trials reveal most clearly is continuity. From Würzburg to Salem, the script barely changed. A woman quarrels, misfortune follows, suspicion grows, authority steps in, confession is forced, and the execution follows. It didn't matter if she was a healer, a midwife, a poor beggar, or a respected matron. Once the wheel of accusation began turning, the outcome was almost guaranteed. So, why were witches almost always women? Because when fear, theology, and politics needed victims, women were already cast in the role. Trials didn't invent the stereotype, they performed it, over and over, until thousands of women were gone, their names erased or vilified. Each case study is a window into that machinery, reminding you that suspicion was never abstract. It was personal, local, and gendered to the core. You've stood in the courts and watched the confessions forced, but now turn your gaze to those who managed to avoid that fate. Survival in a world that hunted witches wasn't random luck. It often depended on how well women conformed to expected roles, how silent they stayed, how submissive they appeared, how carefully they avoided drawing attention. To live was to shrink yourself, to bend into the narrow mould patriarchal society demanded. Witch hunts didn't just kill women, they taught the rest how to live small enough to survive. Start with the basics. Women were safest when attached to men. A husband, a father, or a son could serve as protection. Married women who stayed within the bounds of obedience were less likely to be accused. Not immune, never immune, but safer. A husband's testimony could carry weight in court, his reputation shielding his wife. Widows and spinsters, by contrast, lacked that shield. The lesson was obvious. To survive, you needed male guardianship. Silence was another form of armour. Outspoken women, as you've seen, were vulnerable. Their curses, quarrels, or complaints could be twisted into evidence. So survival often meant biting your tongue, swallowing insults, letting disputes slide. In trial records, you noticed the absence of accusations against women who lived quietly, blending into the background. To be invisible was safer than to be right. Piety helped too. Women who were visibly devout, attending Mass, confessing regularly, demonstrating humility, could deflect suspicion. Some accused women defended themselves by stressing their religious devotion, and in rare cases it worked. Communities hesitant to condemn someone who seemed godly sometimes hesitated long enough for accusations to wither. But piety was a double-edged sword. Excessive devotion could look suspicious, especially if it involved visions or mystical claims. A woman had to walk the fine line of being devout but not too extraordinary. Charity also offered protection. Poor women who begged risked suspicion if they showed resentment when refused, but if they instead offered small acts of kindness, they might be seen as harmless. Sharing food, helping neighbours, nursing the sick, these roles aligned with ideals of feminine virtue. They didn't guarantee safety, but they softened the edges of suspicion. To survive was to perform goodness constantly, without pause. Consider how healing knowledge could be camouflaged. A midwife or herbalist who framed her remedies in overtly Christian terms sometimes avoided charges. She might invoke saints, use holy water, or pray aloud while preparing herbs. By wrapping her knowledge in religious clothing, she reassured her neighbours that her power came from God, not from darker sources. Again, it was about framing. The same act could look like healing or witchcraft depending on how it was presented. There's a grim irony here. Survival required not just avoiding actual witchcraft, which didn't exist in the way authorities imagined, but avoiding even the appearance of independence. Women had to downplay knowledge, mute anger, shrink ambition. To live was to become smaller, quieter, more submissive. In a sense, every execution taught the survivors a lesson. Don't be like her. Take the example of a small Swiss village in the 16th century. Records show a cluster of accusations against widows after a harsh winter. But one widow, Anna, escaped. Why? Because she'd spent years carefully building alliances, godmothering children, lending small amounts of food, praising neighbours loudly. Her conformity, her constant generosity created enough goodwill to deflect suspicion. She survived not because she was innocent, they all were, but because she mastered the performance of harmlessness. Contrast that with the unlucky. A widow who muttered a curse, an herbalist who used Latin words, a spinster who laughed too freely. They became witches in waiting. Conformity was not simply encouraged, it was enforced by the flames. Even in Salem, where panic swept through quickly, you see survival tied to conformity. Some women who confessed and expressed repentance survived. By admitting guilt and submitting to authority, they aligned themselves with expectations of female weakness and obedience. Their confessions reinforced the court's narrative, and in exchange their lives were spared. The lesson was brutal. Deny your agency, admit your corruption, bow to authority, and you may live. Resist, assert innocence, or speak boldly, and you die. Think of how chilling that was. Truth itself became dangerous. The safest lie was submission. Trials weren't just about rooting out supposed witches, they were about teaching women the cost of defiance. Here's a cheeky modern aside. Imagine your boss demanding you admit to crashing the company server, even though you didn't. Deny it, and you're fired. Confess and promise to improve, and you get to keep your job. That's how witch trials worked, except the penalty wasn't unemployment, but execution. Survival depended on surrender. The pressure to conform reached into every corner of life. How women dressed mattered. Bright colours or finery could invite envy. Drab modesty was safer. How they spoke mattered. A quarrel might be remembered years later as evidence. How they worshipped mattered. Too little piety looked suspicious. Too much piety looked suspicious. The narrow path between extremes was exhausting to walk. Communities reinforced this conformity through gossip. Stories of accused women circulated like warnings. She argued with her neighbour, and look what happened. She healed with herbs, and look what happened. Each tale became a lesson for others. Stay in your lane. Generations of women learned to police themselves not because they believed in witchcraft, but because they feared accusation. Men, of course, benefited. Husbands gained obedience by reminding wives of the dangers of stepping out of line. Clergy reinforced authority by linking conformity to salvation. Magistrates ensured quiet villages by making examples of nonconformists. Witch hunts weren't just about fear of demons. They were social control in action, a system that trained women to survive by submission. And yet, not all women conformed quietly. Some resisted, openly or subtly. Trial records sometimes capture women defiantly proclaiming innocence, mocking their accusers, or refusing to confess. Most of them died, but their resistance, even when crushed, reveals cracks in the system. Not every woman accepted the shrinking role. Some clung to dignity even at the stake. Still, survival tilted toward those who learned the rules. To avoid being labelled a witch, you had to embody the opposite: obedient wife, humble mother, pious parishioner, silent neighbour. You had to bury knowledge, temper anger, hide independence. The system rewarded invisibility and punished visibility. Step back and see the larger impact. Witch hunts didn't just kill thousands, they disciplined millions. Every accusation, every execution, sent ripples of fear that shaped women's behaviour across generations. To live safely, women learned to censor themselves. The cost of survival was freedom. So why were witches almost always women? Because the system demanded that women carry the burden of conformity. Accusations fell hardest on those who failed or refused. Survivors learned to bend, to hide, to silence their voices. Witch hunts weren't just about eliminating witches. They were about teaching all women how to live, small, quiet, obedient. You followed the trail of conformity and survival, but now pause to examine the exceptions, the men who were accused of witchcraft. Their presence in trial records complicates the picture, because while witches were overwhelmingly women, some men were also swept up in the panic. Yet their cases revealed just how deeply gender bias shaped the entire system. When men were accused, it was usually for reasons that diverged sharply from those applied to women, and their treatment shows why the overwhelming majority of victims remained female. Start with the numbers. Historians estimate that between 75 and 80% of executed witches were women. That still leaves a significant minority of men, but the contrast is stark. Why the imbalance? Because the cultural scripts of witchcraft, envy, gossip, fertility, sexuality, midwifery, were tied almost entirely to women's roles. Men didn't churn butter, deliver babies, or beg bread at doors, so they weren't as naturally associated with witchcraft. When they were accused, the reasons tended to be different: heresy, political rivalry, or association with already condemned women. Take Germany, again a hotspot of trials. In the massive persecutions at Trier and Würzburg, some men were executed alongside women. But look at the records closely. Many of these men were priests, city officials, or husbands of accused women. Their guilt was often constructed through guilt by association. If a wife confessed under torture, she might implicate her husband. If a child named both parents, courts sometimes condemned them together. Men weren't accused because they fit the stereotype of the witch, but because they were tethered to women who did. Scotland offers another example. In the 1590 North Berwick trials, several men were accused, including schoolmaster Dr. John Fian. He was tortured brutally and accused of leading witches' sabbaths. But even here, the underlying suspicion was linked to politics and threats to the king. Fian was portrayed less as a domestic witch spoiling butter and more as a diabolical conspirator. His case shows how men's accusations were often framed in terms of rebellion or treason, while women's cases focused obsessively on everyday household misfortunes. England's records confirm the pattern. In the 1640s, during the Civil War, Matthew Hopkins, the self-styled witch-finder general, oversaw hundreds of trials. A handful of men were accused, but nearly all were tied to accused women or practiced folk healing. Even then, the questions asked of men differed. Did they consort with spirits? Did they challenge church doctrine? For women, the charges lingered on sour milk, infertility, and envy. Gender shaped not only who was accused, but what they were accused of. Here's a cheeky modern aside. Imagine two co-workers accused of hacking the office Wi-Fi. The woman is grilled about whether she muttered angrily when denied access to the router. The man is accused of plotting a hostile takeover of the entire IT department. Both charges are absurd, but notice how one is domestic and petty, while the other is political and dramatic. That's exactly how witchcraft accusations played out. It's important to see how manuals framed this too. The Malleus Maleficarum acknowledged that men could be witches, but it insisted that women were far more likely to fall. Women, it claimed, were more carnal, more envious, more foolish. Men, if guilty, were exceptions, strange aberrations rather than natural suspects. The text reinforced what society already believed: witchcraft was a woman's crime. But why were some men caught at all? Sometimes sheer hysteria swept them in. In mass panics like Würzburg, where hundreds died, authorities cast the net so wide that men inevitably appeared. Sometimes property disputes or political rivalries targeted men, just as they targeted women. And sometimes clerics or physicians who dabbled in astrology or magic fell under suspicion. Yet even here there was a difference. Male astrologers often escaped with reputations as eccentric scholars, while women healers with herbs were branded witches. The double standard kept men safer. Salem once again illustrates this. Of the 20 executed in 1692, 5 were men, including Giles Corey, who was pressed to death with stones for refusing to plead. But the narratives around male suspects differed. They were accused of aiding female witches, of being consorts rather than initiators. Even in New England, the archetype of the witch remained female. The men were accessories, collateral in a panic that focused on women. Trial language highlights the distinction. Women were described with words like hag, crone, shrew, seductress. Men were sorcerers, heretics, or conspirators. The insults carried different weight, mapping suspicion onto gender roles. Women's charges fit domestic fears. Men's charges fit political or religious anxieties. Another revealing case comes from the Basque country in the early 17th century. Hundreds were accused in massive sweeps, including men. But inquisitors often treated male confessions with skepticism, while women's were taken at face value. Men, after all, were presumed rational. Women, presumed weak, were more naturally witches. Even in large-scale hunts, gender bias tilted the scales. The association of witchcraft with women also tapped into cultural imagery. Folklore teemed with hags, crones, and enchantresses. Even when male sorcerers appeared in tales, they were often rare, exotic, or powerful, like wizards or alchemists. Witches, by contrast, were everyday women. So when villagers whispered about witchcraft, their imagination supplied female faces first. And here's where survival strategies differ. Men, if accused, sometimes had more resources to fight back: education, legal knowledge, networks of support. Women, marginalized and voiceless, rarely did. The imbalance in power reinforced the imbalance in accusations. Pause for a wry observation. Imagine being told that crime is gender neutral, then noticing that 4 out of 5 people executed for it are women. That's witchcraft in a nutshell. Technically, anyone could be a witch. Practically, almost every victim was female. This matters because it shows witch hunts were not simply outbreaks of hysteria, but structured persecutions rooted in gender. Men's presence in the record doesn't disprove that, it highlights it. Their cases underscore how unusual it was for suspicion to fall on them, and how differently the accusations were framed when it did. So, why were witches almost always women? Because the scripts of daily life, envy, gossip, childbirth, sexuality, healing, were gendered female. Because manuals like the Malleus declared women the devil's easiest prey. Because courts, neighbours, and rulers found it easier to blame the powerless than the powerful. Men could be accused, yes, but women were assumed guilty from the start. As you leave this section, remember the imbalance. A few men scattered in records of thousands of women. Their cases prove the possibility but underline the rule. Witchcraft, in the eyes of the early modern Europe, was not just a crime. It was a woman's identity waiting to be exposed. You've seen how men occasionally appeared in trials, but now watch the tide begin to shift. The 17th century's fever burned itself out, and by the 18th, witch hunts began to decline. The change didn't happen overnight, and it didn't erase the scars left on women, but new ways of thinking, new laws, and new politics slowly undermined the obsession. If you want to understand how women finally stepped out from under constant suspicion, you need to trace how science, religion, and government started dismantling the machinery of fear. Begin with science, or rather natural philosophy as it was called then. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries challenged old ways of explaining misfortune. Instead of storms caused by witches, scholars began to study weather patterns. Instead of disease explained by curses, physicians began experimenting with anatomy and circulation. Slowly, people realized that milk curdled because of bacteria, not because the widow next door muttered at you. This didn't make witch trials vanish instantly, but it eroded their foundation. The more rational explanations spread, the less plausible witchcraft looked. Think of figures like Galileo or Descartes. They weren't writing about witches directly, but their insistence on natural laws reshaped thought. If the universe was governed by mathematics and physics, then maybe it wasn't so easily swayed by an old woman's whispered curse. Even skeptics like Reginald Scott, who published The Discovery of Witchcraft in 1584, argued that many accusations were baseless. He mocked the idea of witches flying through the night or transforming into animals. At first, Scott was dismissed, even condemned, but his rationalist voice was a seed that would grow. Legal changes also mattered. In England, by the late 1600s, courts became more cautious. Juries demanded stronger evidence. Torture, long used to extract confessions, began to fall out of favour. Judges grew sceptical of spectral evidence, claims that someone's spirit harmed another. In Salem, after 1692's frenzy, leaders admitted mistakes. By the early 18th century, English courts executed far fewer witches, and by 1735, Parliament passed a law declaring witchcraft not a crime but a form of fraud. In one stroke, the crime of being a witch vanished from the statute books. On the continent, change came unevenly. In some German regions, hunts raged into the late 17th century. But even there, Enlightenment ideas spread. Scholars criticised trials, rulers questioned their usefulness, and some princes outright banned them. The last known execution in Germany occurred in 1775, when Maria Anna Schwegelin was condemned. She was never actually killed, left to languish in prison instead, a sign of waning zeal. Religion too began to soften. The same Reformation that had fueled hunts with zeal also produced skeptics. Protestant thinkers, especially in more urbanized areas, began emphasizing personal responsibility over diabolic conspiracies. Catholic reformers, grappling with Enlightenment ideas, also tempered their views. Sermons shifted from railing about witches to preaching morality in more general terms. The devil was still real, but his supposed servants in the village square looked less convincing. Economic and political changes added pressure. Witch hunts thrived in times of instability, famine, plague, war. As states centralized and economies stabilized, authorities found less need to channel fear into trials. A strong monarchy or centralized government could enforce obedience without scapegoating neighbors as witches. In fact, some rulers realized that hunts were disruptive. Burning half a village did not strengthen order, it created chaos. And chaos was bad for tax collection. Take Prussia under Frederick the Great in the 18th century. He banned witch trials, scoffing at them as superstition. Enlightened rulers realized that executions made their states look backward. Image mattered in an age when monarchs competed to appear modern, rational, and scientific. Witch burning didn't fit the brand. Salem again offers a poignant example. After 1692, Massachusetts turned away from witch trials forever. Ministers admitted error, families of victims sought reparations, and the colony shifted toward more pragmatic governance. The memory of panic served as a warning. Witch hunts were embarrassing, destructive, and unjust. Salem marked not only an end but also a cultural lesson in restraint. Here's a cheeky modern aside. Think of it like phasing out VHS tapes. At first, everyone clung to them, swore they worked fine. But once DVDs and streaming came along, VHS looked clunky, outdated, even ridiculous. That's what happened to witch hunts. Once explanations like science, law, and politics offered smoother answers, the old system of burning women alive looked barbaric and obsolete. And yet, the decline didn't erase the gender bias. Even as trials faded, the memory of women as witches lingered. Folklore, fairy tales, and popular imagination still pictured the witch as female. The stereotype of the hag, the crone, the enchantress didn't vanish with the laws. Instead, it migrated into culture, reshaping itself in softer but still familiar forms. It's striking that the very end of the hunt still bore the same gendered patterns. The last known executions in Europe were nearly all women. Anna Göldi, executed in Switzerland in 1782, is often called the last witch. She was a maid accused of harming her employer's child. By then, Europe was on the cusp of the Enlightenment's full bloom, yet a woman still bore the brunt of suspicion. Her death marks both the persistence of old fears and the difficulty of letting them go. Decline also varied by region. In Poland and parts of Eastern Europe, trials lingered longer. In Scandinavia, Norway executed witches into the 18th century. Local conditions, wars, famines, weak governments, extended the life of hunts, but the overall trajectory was downward. By 1800, witch trials as mass phenomena were gone. So what caused the decline? It wasn't compassion suddenly blooming. It was a mix of skepticism, stronger states, economic stability, and scientific explanations. Theology shifted, but misogyny did not vanish. Women stopped being executed as witches not because societies valued them more, but because the machinery of blame broke down under modern pressures. And that brings us back to the larger story. For centuries, women bore the weight of superstition, theology, and envy. They were accused, tortured, and killed because systems of power needed scapegoats. As those systems changed, the scapegoating changed too. Witch hunts ended, but the logic, blaming women for social ills, remained. reshaped in new forms. So why were witches almost always women? Because for as long as witchcraft was considered real, it was defined through women's bodies, roles, and supposed weaknesses. When witchcraft ceased to be real in the eyes of law and science, women finally stepped off the pyres, but they didn't escape the stereotypes. The witch, as cultural symbol, lived on long after the trial stopped, a ghostly reminder of centuries of persecution. The fires smoulder, the courts quiet, and the laws shift, but the story doesn't end with the decline of executions. Witch hunts left a scar that never fully healed. Even after the last trials faded in the late 18th century, the cultural image of the witch endured, and almost always in female form. The legacy of centuries of suspicion still shapes how women are imagined, feared, and controlled. If you want to see why witches were almost always women, look not only at who burned, but at who still lives in the stories we tell. Think first of folklore. Fairy tales across Europe preserve the witch as the stock villain, the crone who lures children, the stepmother who plots harm, the enchantress who tempts men. From the Brothers Grimm to Shakespeare's Macbeth, the figure of the witch is nearly always a woman. These stories carried forward the stereotypes trial courts had cemented: women as envious, dangerous, lustful, and destructive. The courtroom pyres may have cooled, but the imagination kept burning. And notice the details. The fairy tale witch is often old, ugly, toothless, echoing the accused widows and beggars of real villages. Or she is seductive, mysterious, luring men to ruin, echoing fears of female sexuality. Either way, the script is the same. Women's bodies are sites of suspicion. Men appear as wizards, alchemists, or sages, figures of knowledge and power. Women appear as witches, figures of fear. The cultural shadow of witch hunts thus hardened into archetypes that survive even now. The stereotype also carried into language. Even today, witch can be used as an insult, aimed almost exclusively at women. A quarrelsome woman might be called a witch. A quarrelsome man is rarely called a wizard. The insult carries centuries of weight, even when used casually. It reminds you how deeply gendered suspicion became, how lasting the mark was. The witch also became a paradoxical symbol of resistance. In the 19th and 20th centuries, feminists began reclaiming the figure of the witch as a symbol of female power suppressed by patriarchy. The very traits condemned, independence, knowledge, sexuality, became rebranded as strengths. Movements like WITCH, Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, in the 1960s, declared witches icons of liberation. In that reclamation, you see the irony. What once condemned women to death became a badge of defiance. But the stereotype also kept working in subtler ways. Women who defied norms, outspoken, independent, political, continued to be demonized with witch-like imagery. Think of how powerful women in history, from queens to revolutionaries, were slandered as sorceresses or enchantresses. The legacy of the hunts lingered as a cultural reflex. Strong women must be dangerous. Even medicine carried echoes. For centuries after witch trials ended, midwives and female healers still face marginalization, their knowledge sidelined by male physicians. The idea that women's healing was suspect, planted during hunts, lingered in the professionalization of medicine. Male doctors became legitimate. Women's remedies became folklore, the same old suspicion, dressed in modern clothing. Here's a modern aside. Imagine centuries from now, people still using hacker as a synonym for teenager. That's what happened with witches and women. The association lasted long after the actual prosecution stopped. The legacy also shows in how societies remember. When monuments go up for victims of witch trials, in Salem, in Würzburg, in Vardø, Norway, they are overwhelmingly dedicated to women. The silence of centuries is broken with plaques, memorials, and names etched in stone. Communities now confront the fact that their ancestors killed neighbours, mothers, daughters, grandmothers, not because they were guilty, but because they were women in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yet, even in remembrance, the stereotypes linger. Halloween witches, cackling with brooms and cats, recycle the old imagery. Children dress up as the crone, not as the alchemist. The joke still relies on centuries of gendered suspicion. It's playful now, but the roots run deep. The question lingers. Why were witches almost always women? The answer is layered. because doctrine defined women as weak, because Eve's myth framed them as sinful, because their work in healing and childbirth made them suspect, because their sexuality was feared, because manuals like the Malleus codified it, because envy, jealousy, and political power needed scapegoats, and because once burned into culture, the image never left. The witch became not just a victim of history, but a mirror of society's anxieties about women. Too visible, too independent, too different, and a woman risked being branded dangerous. That brand shifted forms across centuries, but the logic stayed. Witch hunts may have ended, but suspicion of women's power never really disappeared. Now let the pace soften. The crackle of fire in the square fades. The jeering crowd drifts home. The smoke lifts into the night, and silence settles on the cobbles. You breathe slowly, feeling centuries of fear slide backward into memory. The women accused are gone, but their shadows whisper still. They remind you how fragile freedom can be, how easily fear twists into violence, how deeply gender shapes history. Yet they also remind you of resilience, of women who survived by conformity, of those who resisted even at the stake, of those who reclaimed the witch as a symbol of strength. Let the images dissolve now, the torchlight, the shackles, the sermons. Replace them with softer ones. A quiet room, a steady candle, the calm rhythm of your own breath. You're safe here, centuries away from the panic. The voices of the past grow faint, their shouts turning into whispers, then into nothing at all. Each sentence stretches longer now, like steps slowing after a long walk. You picture the witches, not as hags or seductresses, but as neighbours, mothers, daughters, women who laughed, worked, and lived. You let them rest, no longer hunted, no longer accused. The story dims to a hush. The flames that once consumed lives flicker into embers, glowing softly in memory rather than rage. The night folds around you gently, reminding you that history's cruelties belong to the past, even if their echoes linger. Breathe in, breathe out. The last words fall like a whisper. Sleep now, with the past quiet at last, and let the long shadow of the witch dissolve into calm.